On the morning of January 12, 1943, Thomas Sullivan rose before dawn in his home at 98 Adams Street in Waterloo, Iowa. He was a freight conductor for the Illinois Central Railroad, a quiet, steady man who had spent the war watching the calendar and waiting for letters. 5 sons were somewhere in the Pacific. 5 sons, and on that particular morning, a black sedan pulled up outside his house before he had finished his breakfast. He watched the 3 men in naval uniforms climb out. He had known, in the way that fathers know things they cannot afford to believe, that this moment was coming. He stepped to the door and let them in. Lieutenant Commander Truman Jones stood in the kitchen, with a doctor and a chief petty officer on either side of him. Jones had prepared his words on the drive over. There was no good way to say them. "I have some news for you about your boys," Jones said. Thomas Sullivan's answer was just 2 words. "Which one?" Jones swallowed hard. "It was the saddest task of his naval career," he answered. "I'm sorry. All 5. There are moments in the history of a war that open up beneath a family like a trapdoor. Moments that reveal the full weight of what a nation asks of its people. The story of Thomas Sullivan and his 5 sons is one of them. It is not a story of a battlefield. It is the story of the home front's longest silence, a father's steadiest grief, and the question of what a nation owes the men and women it calls upon to give everything. Thomas Francis Sullivan was born in 1883 in Waterloo, Iowa, the grandson of immigrants from Ireland. He worked hard, raised a family, and by the late 1930s had 5 sons and 1 daughter in a house on Adams Street. The 5 boys were close, in the way that boys raised together in a working-class Midwestern household become close. Inseparable, looking out for each other, finishing each other's sentences. George was the eldest, born in December 1914, followed by Francis, Frank in 1916, then Joseph in 1918, Madison in 1919, and Albert, the youngest, in 1922. They grew up during the Depression, worked at the Rath packing plant together, played baseball together, and in the way of that particular generation of American men, they moved through life as a unit. George and Frank had already served a stretch in the Navy. They enlisted in 1937, served on USS Hovey, and were honorably discharged in May 1941. By that December, they were back in Waterloo, working civilian jobs, living at home. For a brief stretch, the war was a thing happening somewhere else. Then came the morning of December 7th. A family friend named Bill Ball was a seaman first class aboard USS Arizona. He was killed when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor destroyed the ship along with more than 1,100 of her crew. The Sullivan brothers knew Bill Ball well. His death hit the family like a personal wound. Within weeks, all 5 brothers, George, Frank, Joe, Matt, and Al, had made up their minds. They were going back in. On January 3, 1942, the 5 Sullivans appeared together at the Naval Recruiting Station in Des Moines, Iowa. They had one condition, and they stated it plainly. They would serve together, or they would not serve at all. The Navy had a general policy discouraging siblings from assignment to the same ship. The executive officer of USS Juneau would later repeat his objections. But the Sullivans were firm, and the Navy, facing an enormous wartime expansion, and needing every man it could enlist, bent its own rule. The 5 brothers reported together to Great Lakes Naval Training Center, and on February 3, 1942, they joined the light cruiser USS Juneau at the New York Navy Yard. George Sullivan, making the case in writing to the Navy, put it in a single sentence: "If we go down, we'll all go together." He meant it as resolve. It became a prophecy. USS Juneau was a 6,000-ton Atlanta-class light cruiser, fast, lightly armored, armed primarily for anti-aircraft work. The 5 Sullivans settled into their billets, George as gunner's mate second class, Frank as coxswain, and Joe, Matt, and Al as seaman second class. They ate together, worked together, and wrote letters home. Thomas Sullivan saved everyone. In the late summer of 1942, Juneau transferred to the Pacific. The campaign around Guadalcanal was by then the bloodiest, most contested patch of ocean in the American War. The Navy fighting a grinding, costly struggle with the Imperial Japanese Navy for control of the waters around the island, while Marines fought in the jungle below. Juneau's task force moved into those waters in November. On November 12, 1942, during the opening engagement of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, one of the most violent sea battles of the Pacific War, a night engagement in which ships fought each other at close range, and 2 American admirals were killed. Juneau took a torpedo hit that damaged her badly. She survived the fight and limped southward with the task force, the following morning, down by the bow, struggling to make 18 knots. She was a wounded ship in contested waters, and the task force around her pressed on, watching for submarines. Japanese submarine I-26 found her. On the morning of November 13, 1942, I-26 fired a torpedo that struck Juneau amidships and detonated in or near her main ammunition magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. Witnesses on other ships described it as a tremendous eruption, fire and debris launching high into the air. Juneau sank in approximately 20 minutes. Of the 697 men aboard, 687 were killed. Only 10 survived. Francis, Joseph, and Madison Sullivan died instantly when the ship exploded. Albert, wounded, made it onto a life raft and may have survived until the following day before drowning. George, badly wounded, clung to a raft for 4 or 5 days before he, too, slipped beneath the surface. A shipmate wrote to Thomas and Alleta later to tell them what he had witnessed. There was no softening of it. Back in Waterloo, the calendar turned to December and then to January. No letters arrived. Thomas Sullivan continued going to work. Alleta continued writing. The Navy, constrained by wartime security requirements that prevented disclosure of ship losses that might aid the enemy, said nothing officially. The silence stretched across 6 weeks. Then, in early January 1943, a neighbor woman came to Alleta Sullivan with news she had received in a letter from her son, who was also serving in the Pacific. He had mentioned the Sullivan boys in passing. He had written, "Wasn't it too bad about the Sullivan boys?" Alleta wrote immediately to the Bureau of Naval Personnel. The letter was direct and heartbroken. A mother had heard from a fellow Navy mother that her 5 sons had been killed. Was it true? She begged for an answer. The letter made its way to Washington, and President Franklin Roosevelt wrote back personally on January 13, 1943, characterizing the brothers only as missing in action. A truthful, careful answer, because officially that was all that had been confirmed. Roosevelt wrote that the entire nation shares your sorrow. His letter arrived one day too late to soften the blow. Before it reached Waterloo, 3 men in naval uniforms had already climbed out of a black sedan on Adams Street. Which one? Thomas Sullivan had asked. I'm sorry, all 5. What happened inside that kitchen on Adams Street on that January morning is not fully recorded. What is recorded is what Thomas Sullivan did in the days, weeks, and months that followed. He did not withdraw from the world. He did not allow his grief to become an argument against the war his sons had chosen to fight. He and Alleta made a decision that those who knew them described as an act of almost incomprehensible fortitude. They would take their loss on the road. They would use it. Thomas and Alleta Sullivan joined a war bond tour and began visiting factories, shipyards, and manufacturing plants across the country. By the Navy's own records, they appeared at more than 200 facilities, speaking to the workers who were building the ships and planes and guns that their sons had died using. Thomas Sullivan stood before those workers, men and women who had their own sons and husbands and brothers in the fight, and he asked them to keep going. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked for production. He asked them to build faster and better and more, so that his sons' deaths would mean something. Think for a moment about what that required. Thomas Sullivan was not a public man. He was a railroad conductor from Waterloo, Iowa. Someone who spent his working days moving freight and coming home to a house full of boys. He was not trained for speech-making or accustomed to standing in front of crowds. Yet 200 times, he stood on factory floors and in shipyards while workers set down their riveting guns and looked up. And he told them about his sons and why the work could not stop. Genevieve, his only surviving daughter, enlisted in the Navy's waves in April 1943. The entire family turned its grief into a forward-leaning force rather than a wall. It was a form of sacrifice that has no medal attached to it. On April 4, 1943, at the Federal Shipbuilding Company in Kearny, New Jersey, Alleta Sullivan stood at the bow of a Fletcher-class destroyer. President Roosevelt had ordered the ship named in honor of her 5 sons, the first American naval vessel ever to be named for more than one person. The ship's motto, adopted from George Sullivan's own words, was engraved for all who served aboard her. We stick together. Alleta broke the ceremonial bottle against the hull and christened her USS the Sullivans. Thomas Sullivan watched. The 5 brothers who had enlisted together, insisted on serving together, and died together were now carried forward in steel and iron, carried into the waters where they had gone down and beyond. USS the Sullivans went on to serve in World War II in Korea. Decades later, a second destroyer, DDG-68, was commissioned in the brothers' name, and it sails still. Albert Sullivan's son James later served aboard the first USS the Sullivans. His grandmother had christened the ship his father died fighting for. Albert's granddaughter christened the second one. The deaths of the 5 Sullivan brothers changed something permanent in how the United States military thought about families. The loss had exposed the full cost of allowing siblings to serve together with no safeguard for what remained. In the months after November 1942, the Navy began quietly adjusting its approach. In the years that followed, Congress acted. The sole survivor policy was enacted into law in 1948, establishing the right of a family's last surviving son to be protected from service if others had already been lost in combat. The law has been amended and expanded in the decades since, extended to include daughters, to cover families whose sons never became sole survivors but simply lost a father. Every amendment carries the same acknowledgement that the nation's claim on a family's service has a limit, and that limit was drawn, in large part, by the price the Sullivans paid on the morning of November 13, 1942, and the morning of January 12, 1943. Thomas Sullivan lived until 1965, more than 20 years after that January morning. He saw the destroyer christened. He saw his daughter-in-law's boy serve on the ship that bore his son's name. He saw the policy that came from their deaths become law. He watched, quietly, as the country continued the work of building the world his boys had gone out to defend. He never stopped going to work. He never asked for recognition. He had asked once a single question and been given the only answer that the war had left him. Alleta Sullivan lived until 1972. She outlasted her husband by 7 years. She and Thomas are buried together in Waterloo. In Waterloo today, there is a Sullivan Brothers Iowa Veterans Museum, opened in 2008, housed in a building that looks out over the same city those 5 young men left on a January morning in 1942. Inside are photographs and letters, the kind of letters that were commonplace in the early 1940s, when tens of millions of families were sending their sons and husbands and brothers across an ocean. The Sullivan letters are there. Thomas's name is on them, and Alleta's, and the names of all 5 boys. The last letter from any of the brothers was dated November 8, 1942, 5 days before USS Juneau went down. In the war that killed more than 400,000 Americans, the losses fell unevenly and without mercy. Some families sent 1, some sent 2. Thomas and Alleta Sullivan sent 5, and stood at 200 factory floors and asked the workers there to build enough to end it. No decoration was ever awarded to a father for that kind of endurance. No medal was struck for the kind of courage it takes to go back to work the day after you hear all 5, and then get on a train to stand before strangers and ask them not to stop. The ship still sails. The policy still holds. The letters are still in Waterloo. What Thomas Sullivan gave the country on that January morning was not given with fanfare, or ceremony, or the sound of a bottle breaking against steel. It was given in silence, in a kitchen in Iowa, with 2 words that carried everything a father could ask, in a world that had already taken everything a father could lose.